Paul Johnson has been director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the UK's leading economic research institute since 2011. The IFS became the first organisation to win the Prospect Think Tank of the Year award 2 years in a row in 2014 and 2015, and has won Economic and Financial Think Tank of the Year 4 years in succession. Paul is also a visiting professor in the economics department at UCL and a columnist for The Times. He is a board member of the Climate Change Committee, of the Office of Tax Simplification and of the Banking Standards Board, and is currently a trustee of the King's Fund. I am delighted to introduce to you Paul Johnson.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Nick. I'm just going to spend a few minutes, I think, not providing you with any certainty or clarity, I'm afraid, about what's going to happen and what is happening in the economy, but at least giving you some sense of at least what some of the uncertainties are. If you want to find out more about what we've been doing at the IFS, then we've published, I think, 40 pieces in the last couple of months, which you can find on the website there at www.ifs.org.uk. But let me just jump straight in by showing you this chart from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which shows their estimate of what might happen to national income over this year and then going forward. So this chart shows you GDP growth over the last 120 years, and you can see that their forecast for this year is considerably worse than for any year over that whole 120-year period. And indeed, the Bank of England reckon that this year will be the worst year since 1606. I think we can take it that that means that this year will be the worst year in history in terms of what's going to happen to our national income and wealth. That, in a sense, is a given. That is not surprising, given that we have shut down a large fraction of the economy. And in one sense, it's a strange thing to say, doesn't actually matter that much if, as the OBR and indeed the bank have in their baseline scenarios, the economy just bounces back to where it otherwise would have been within a year or two. So in other words, if we have a year or two, we have a year or less of what we've got at the moment, and then everything gets back to normal, then we don't have too much to worry about. I personally think it's quite odd that they chose those as what they call their baseline scenarios, because I don't actually know anyone who thinks that is the most likely outcome. At the very least, we have risks, clearly, with second waves of the infection and having to lock down again. But even if we don't have that, the chances that we can lock the economy down for 3 or 6 months, however long it is, and not suffer what in economics terms we call scarring, so not suffer from businesses closing, unemployment rising, and therefore some considerable period before we get back to something approaching normal, is extremely unlikely. And that actually will underlie a lot of what I'm going to say. If these baseline scenarios, which suggest we bounce back to normal very quickly, are right, then in a sense everything will be well. But I don't think they are right, and therefore I don't think everything will be well. So that's the sort of fundamental economic background. We shut down a chunk of the economy. Not surprisingly, we're going to have the worst year in history for economic growth. What matters next, though, is what really matters. So that's what's happened to the economy as a result of the virus and the decisions made by government to essentially shut down a large part of it. How has government responded? Well, it's responded in a quite extraordinary way with a huge package of spending. I've listed the big elements there in terms of what government's doing. Extra money for the health service and other bits of the public services. By far the biggest thing here is the coronavirus job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, which provides employers or employees with 80% of their previous salary, up to £2,500 a month, which the OBR now reckons will cost over £60 billion to the end of July. The Chancellor, I thought rather surprisingly earlier this week, announced that it would continue in some form until the end of October, possibly with some cost sharing with employers. So that 63 billion that you see there doesn't even include the possible cost beyond the end of July, because we don't know what the scheme will look like. And I'll come back to that scheme in a minute, because it is terribly important for the government response, terribly important for individuals, and a really difficult thing to move on from. There's been some increases in There's been another scheme which is intended to achieve a similar thing for the self-employed. I can talk in questions if you want to know more about the details of that scheme. Some increases in the generosity of benefits, big changes in business rates, and a cost of all of those together more than £120 billion. So £120 billion over less than a 6-month period. That is more than the cost of running the health service over that period. The word unprecedented has been used an unprecedented number of times recently, but that is a genuinely staggering amount of money for government to make available over such a short period and so quickly. So that's the response to the big hit to the economy. Take the hit to the economy and that huge response, and we now expect borrowing this year to reach £300 billion. That's about 15% of national income. That's much higher than borrowing was at its height during the financial crisis. That's easily the highest level of borrowing in peacetime in this country. And it's worth saying, I'm talking about the UK here, but most countries could tell a rather similar story. So borrowing peaked at about 10% of national income in 2010. It's looking at 15% of national income this year, so 50% higher. The government is therefore having to sell an awful lot of debt. I mean, this is another terrifying chart. It's looking to sell over £200 billion worth of debt in just the next 4 months. Again, that's more than twice the peak level of debt issuance at the height of the last crisis, and it will remain high for some considerable period. So the amount of debt that the markets need to be willing to take needs to remain high. Although, of course, the Bank of England is standing behind a lot of this with its quantitative easing program. Again, happy to say more about that if people have questions. So huge hit to the economy, huge fiscal response, huge hit, therefore, to the public finances. And going back to my previous point, what really matters here is what happens next. Bizarre to say, if the economy does bounce back to normal quickly, then actually the odd 300 billion of additional debt doesn't really matter. The government will simply take that on and it will dissipate over time as the economy hopefully grows. That's essentially what happened after the Second World War, after the Napoleonic Wars, if you want to go back that far, a big increase in debt which dissipated over time as the economy grew. What really matters, though, is what happens in the medium to long term to the size of the economy. Some of you will have seen the leaked Treasury paper in the Telegraph yesterday, suggesting the Treasury is already thinking about increasing taxes and cutting spending in the medium run to respond to what could be a persistent deficit. The key point here is if there's a medium-term loss to the size of the economy, what does that mean in simple terms? It just means we will all be poorer than we expected. If we're all poorer than we expected, then if we want public services at the level we were expecting, we'll have to use a bigger fraction of our income to pay for them. Big political questions there, big questions about the way in which that's done. Again, we could spend a long time talking about that, and happy to take questions on that set of issues. But rather than do that, I want to say a couple more things about who it is. So I've talked very much about the macroeconomy up till now. Who's being affected? Well, despite all of those government interventions, we know there's been a huge impact on individuals already. There have been 1.8 million more claims to universal credit than expected over the last couple of months. This chart shows daily claims for universal credit. You can see pre-lockdown, that was moving around about 10 to 15,000 new claims a day. It peaked at nearly 150,000 new claims a day. You can see it's been tailing off over the last month or so, but that is a huge increase in caseload. It is essentially telling us that that number of, not all of those people will be unemployed, but the large fraction of them will have lost their jobs despite the furlough scheme. What sorts of people will have lost their jobs? Well, this chart gives you some sense of where that might be going on. This is showing you the fraction of businesses in different sectors of the economy that have completely shut or had completely shut during April. You can see that 80% of businesses in, as you'd expect, in food and accommodation and arts and recreation have shut entirely over that period. Actually, quite large fractions of construction, motor vehicle, and manufacturing have also shut. The result is that a quarter of staff across the economy have been furloughed, a quarter furloughed. You may have seen headlines saying half of the workforce is now paid by the government. That's because about a quarter are also public sector workers. So half of us are now being paid for by the government. Again, you can see from this why it's so difficult to move away from the furlough scheme. If the accommodation, food and recreation sectors remain closed, then you probably need the furlough scheme much as it is, providing 80% of earnings. But what you don't want necessarily is doing that for other sectors where they've got more choice about what they do. There's no question that the scheme turned out to be much more widespread and much more expensive than the Treasury initially intended, because many more businesses shut down than was initially expected, perhaps because the scheme was there to allow them to do so. So moving out of that, do it too quickly, people lose their jobs, businesses go bust, and we have the scarring I was talking about before. Do it too slowly, far too expensive, and you risk keeping businesses going which don't actually have a future, and you delay the recovery. A very tough thing for government to work through. Who's being affected? What this chart is showing you is that lower earners are 7 times more likely to work in those shutdown sectors than the highest earners. Shutdown sectors, hospitality, retail, and so on, tend to have low earners working in them. So this is very unequally felt by income, by social class, also by ethnicity. Very different effects on different people in the population. Here, you see it's also very unequal by age. People under the age of 25 are about 2.5 times as likely as those over the age of 25 to be working in shutdown sectors. Affects women more than men. So again, you can look at the big overarching fiscal and economic issues that are going on, but they affect different people differently. Finally, all sorts of things for the future. I'll run through these very quickly. We've focused the health service, and there's been in the headlines today, on dealing with the coronavirus crisis. Non-urgent elective operations have been cancelled. Hundreds of thousands of patients have not had the operations they expected. There'll be long-term knock-on effects from that, as well as big reductions in those going to A&E. Even if the only thing you care about is health, then there are long-term consequences of this. We know that recessions, we know that unemployment are bad for health in the long run. They increase mortality. The last recession, best estimates suggest, added 900,000 chronic health problems to the community as a result of the unemployment that resulted from that. So that's one. There's a big set of health issues. There's a big issue, again, a generational issue. I've shown you that younger people are more affected by this than older people, but young people moving out of school and moving out of university into the labour market this year are likely to face long-term consequences for their employment and earnings. We know from previous recessions that that's true. We know also that by shutting schools, we're particularly hurting children from less well-off families. We've got some research coming out on Saturday, this weekend, surveying families, showing that children from less well-off families are much less likely actually to be getting tuition from their school, and certainly less likely to be getting tuition from their parents over this period. So we could again be increasing inequality as a result of this. I've talked about the fiscal response. It could be big in the medium term. We could end up with a very different shape of tax system, shape of public spending, and of course the structure of the economy may change as some of these sectors that are shut down now don't recover at all quickly, if at all. So all sorts of consequences here, including for people's wealth. Let me conclude by saying this probably is making us poorer into the long run. Making us poorer into the long run is going to have a series of knock-on consequences for our health, our wealth, public services, and the tax system. What really matters is much less actually what happens over the next 2 or 3 months. We know that this will be the deepest recession in history. What really matters is how we come out of that, and how well government and the bank of England between them support us in coming out of that and don't leave us in a worse position than we absolutely need to be. And of course, in doing that, we do have to, incidentally, keep control of the virus itself. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul.